It's a great honour to be invited to give a lecture to inaugurate the David Brooks Archive at Durham University's Palace Green Library. The manner for giving this lecture is somewhat unusual, as I am unable through illness to come to Durham and give the lecture in person. I'm giving the lecture by Skype from Copenhagen and am recording the sound on my computer. My colleague in Durham, Bob Simpson, will manage the PowerPoint slides. And as the Skype is only working one way, any communication between me and Bob will be by telephone. My friend from my fieldwork area, Sabir Razmadui, has kindly agreed to put the recording and the slides together. The lecture is entitled Iranian Archives at Durham, a personal reflection on people, places and the public record. And new additions to the Palace Green Archive mean that there will now be 3 bodies of research materials about rural and tribal Iran in the archive, spanning much of the 20th century. First, there's the archive of Anne Lampton, perhaps the foremost researcher in rural Iran, and here we should switch to the next slide, whose work extends from the mid-1930s to the late 1960s. Second, there is David Brooks's research on the Bakhtiaris of Iran throughout the 1960s. And third is my own research in Doshman-Ziari Mamasani in the 1970s and after the Islamic Revolution in the 1990s. To give a historical context, at the bottom of this slide I've given a timeline starting in 1925 with the military coup led by Reza Pahlavi, so that you can see that the Reza Shah crowned himself in 1925, then forcibly settled the tribes. He abdicated during the war and his son took over. After the war, they started doing 7-year planning and the modernization, as they called it, of Iran. In 1951-3, you have an elected government of Mossadegh that was deposed, and the Shah was reinstated after Mossadegh had nationalized the oil. And then in the 60s, you've got land reform, followed by what the Shah called his White Revolution, and 79, the Islamic Revolution. So Anne Lampton is there for the earlier period, David for the 60s, and me in the 70s. The next slide shows the map of Iran, which my research assistant Dalia, who's in the room here with me, he's prepared this. You can see running from the northwest to the southeast of Iran, there's a row of mountains called the Zagros Mountains, which are like pleats. They've been squashed, pleated up together. And in the middle is where the Bakhtiari tribe were, where David visited. And then southeast of that, there's a little black blob, which is Doshman-Ziari Mamasani, where I was. So the next slide sets out the questions that I want to answer in this talk. How did these people do their field research at different moments in the modernization of the Iranian state? What were the debates about changing power relations that they encountered? And how did they participate and or research them? And how are these experiences and stories archived? For which publics? So there's 3 big questions there. The structure of the talk is I'll start with Anne Lampton and give a brief introduction to her work. Because I'm sick and wheezing in Copenhagen, I haven't been able to come over and spend some time in her archive prior to this talk as I'd hoped, so I apologise for that. But I have reread her books last week, so there's an advantage. And what I want to do is introduce her work very briefly, because it does set out a very good context for both David's work and my work. And then I'll mainly focus on David's work and then give a taster of my work. I'm hoping that I have more opportunities to come and work with colleagues in Durham, and there might be other opportunities to develop my work further. So next slide takes us to Anne Lambton. She was a linguist and historian of Persian government administration from the Seljuks right in the 11th, 12th century to the Pahlavis. Just a little bit about her background. She comes from the Lambton family from the northeast of England, which has always had a very big role in national public affairs, major landowning family with coal interests. But she comes from a junior arm of that family, and her father was a leading racehorse trainer. So she grew up riding horses. She never went to school. And she's named after Swynford, is the most famous of her father's racehorses, which is pictured on the top right of the slide. One of her father's friends suggests to her that, why don't you come to SOAS and read Persian? So she does, and she gets a degree in 1935, and in 1939 she completes her PhD looking at the government institutions of the Seljuks. Then war breaks out, and during the war she's in Iran as the press attaché of the British Embassy. And there she gets to know everybody, both within Persian ruling circles and British ones. After the war, she comes back to England and she's appointed lecturer in Persian studies at SOAS, where she stays for the whole of her career. Another point is that she was very, very active in the Church of England, both in the Middle East and in the Northeast, and was given the Cross of St. Augustine in 2004. So that's a brief introduction to who she is. Moving to the next slide. She really was, both when David and I were doing our work, the person with unrivaled knowledge of rural Iran. She specialized in studying the governance of Iran, but one of the points she made was that the governance of Iran really depends on the administration of the land, because the prosperity and the revenues of the state derive from land. Break. Hello? Okay. Am I back on again now? Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye. Frank Cardo's got nothing on this. Okay. Unrivaled knowledge of rural Iran. So she was an expert on the history of the governance of the Iranian state. And one of the important aspects of governance was actually the administration of land, which takes her into starting to look at the land tenure systems. And she points out that the whole income of the Iranian state depended on the peasants, in her words, not being unduly depressed. Now, she was fluent in Persian. She was a real linguist, and she read all the law texts right through from the Seljuks through and the government documents about land tenure. She read the books in philosophy and jurisprudence. She read the historians and the geographers' accounts. So she had a terrific textual knowledge of the land reform or the land administration system in Iran. But above that, she then spent a lot of time traveling around, going to villages all over Iran. I went to see her once and said, do you have any information on the village where I was? And she came back a month later with notes from where she'd been and what she'd seen, who she'd talked to. And she travelled on horseback or camel or whatever means of transport there was. She was a very indomitable figure, I think the word would be. And she, in the next slide, she then studied what the problems were and what needed to be done in terms of land reform. And she argued that there's a system of large-scale landlords, but small-scale farming, or small-scale peasant farming. And the relations between landlord and peasant are based on a sharecropping contract. So the sharecropping contract is really important to understand, to know how the administration is working. And the landlords weren't like her own landed family in Northumberland or Durham. They weren't a landed hereditary aristocracy. They were part of an urban elite, or they moved into the urban elite. So there was no presence in the rural area. They sent their agents out. And she argues strongly that there was a very arbitrary nature of power. The peasants, she said, are indebted. They often sell their crop the year before it's actually harvested in order to live. And then they sell the crop in the winter when they're having to pay a lot for a debt, and then they give the crop to the moneylender in the summer when the price is depressed. So they lose out every way. So she says there's extortion, they lack capital for tools, for fertilizer, and they're powerless to change anything. The result of all this isn't just poor hard peasantry, but very low productivity, agricultural productivity in Iran. There had been attempts at land reforms in 1907, 1952 and 1960, which she was extremely critical of them. There's no grasp of the variety of rural problems. And through reading her books again, it's really clear that she's defining what she thinks needs to be done. Reforms must intend to improve the life of peasants and give them responsibility and control of their own and village affairs, not replace arbitrary authority of landlords with that of government. And she makes this point over and over again through her two main books. Now, in 1962, the Minister of Agriculture is somebody called Dr. Arsanjani, and she takes a shine to him. She says that he has unrivaled knowledge of rural population, genuine concern for peasants. He is a radical, outspoken berater of the landlord class. If she was in England, she would not be liking him at all, I think. But in Iran, she really sees he's saying the kind of things that need to be said. I also wonder whether she was such pals with him because he seems to have used her books as a major source. But that's being a bit cheeky, I suppose. Anyway, the 1962 reform is very pragmatic and it works very rapidly. The idea is that landlords can keep one village, the government buys the other villages, the government then sells the land to the existing cultivators. There's no redistribution of land. Peasants who've got land keep land, peasants without land don't get any. But the recipients have to join a co-op. And she says that the result of this was to break the power of the landlords, make the peasants responsible for running their own affairs. Excuse me a minute. If we go to the next slide, you can see that in 20 months, this minister really got cracking. And everyone thought that this would be another reform like all the others, that nobody ever manages to get through the inertia of the Persian bureaucracy. But he really did. And within 20 months, 8,000 villages have been bought, redistributed to 270,000 peasants, and 2,000 co-ops have been set up. Now, there's lots and lots of arguments that, this wasn't perfect, but her argument is at least he did something. And he did it with a corps of about 1,000 officers across the country, whom she describes as diligent and enthusiastic. The landlords, the tribal leaders and the religious leaders had initially believed that this would be like all the others and just fall flat. But when it actually began to work, they began to resist it. So in 1963, Dr. Arsanjani called a national congress of 4,700 peasants who had joined cooperatives. And this, says Lambton, gave them a sense of unity, an idea of the self-reliant and independent peasant was a possibility, and increased the momentum for land reform. The Shah, on the back of that, declared a referendum and what he called the White Revolution. In the midst of this, Rafsanjani had become far too popular for the Shah's liking, and he resigned. After that, the land reform slowed down. The government obviously feared loss of political control over the peasants, and also moved in favour of agribusinesses rather than improving peasant agriculture. So Lambton comes in again at that point, arguing the government's concern should be to create an independent and prosperous peasantry, not tighter control. She has this argument running through and through and through her work. So the next slide shows that the Shah built on the land reform into what he called a white revolution. And part of that was to settle nomads. They were obviously dusty nomads walking through the landscape with camels and things, was a complete anachronism when he was trying to build up an army and a flashy air force and smart roads, and you can't have nomads wandering around. They nationalised the forests and the pasture lands and the water, and that has big implications for the area where I worked. Set up education systems that were aiming to try and persuade people to think of themselves as citizens of Iran, and develop some public services. Men in particular had to do military service, and if they had a degree or an appropriate education, they were allowed to join the literacy corps, the health corps, and the reconstruction corps instead. They introduced a vote for women, and they did some work in developing enterprises, share owning and things. Those are the main ingredients of the White Revolution, but they're even part of a bigger story, which was the Shah's idea of a modern state, classic for many countries in that period. Building up a bureaucracy, new ministries were being set up when David arrived in Tehran. The plan organisation was set up with its 7-year plans. Military power was a very important thing. They brought in subsidised wheat in particular and subsidised food prices for the towns. Meanwhile, there was a lot of people going to the West for education and coming back often quite critical of what they were seeing here. And a very strong secret police called Savak was put in force to control all of the dissident elements all around. So that's the context, really, when David arrives in Iran in the next slide. So just to introduce David very briefly, he comes from Karluk in Lanarkshire, where I understand the family have had a high street store for many generations. His mother pointed out to me that he was a very good Scottish dancer as young, and that is a very important aspect of who David is and how he does his fieldwork. In 1962, he did a BA in psychology at Glasgow. In 1963, he moved to Oxford and did the diploma in anthropology. And in 1964 to 1967, he did fieldwork in the Bakhtiari and joined their spring migrations in 1964 and 1966. He was advisor and scriptwriter for a Hollywood film on the Bakhtiari, which was called People of the Wind. And he set up the crew with his contacts in the Bakhtiari, including the guy featured on the horse in this slide, who is Jafar Quli Kalantar of the Barbadi. And he made the introductions and set up for the film crew to accompany him on his migration. And then he wrote the script and spent a semester or more in Hollywood working on the film. On the next slide, I want to just reflect a minute on how I set up the archive for David's work, because he appointed me his literary executor, and when he died, I went to visit the house, and Rory opened the door on David's office, and when he'd become sick, the department had moved all the contents of his departmental office and deposited it in his home study, and the whole room was completely crammed with stalagmites of paper that were about 2 to 3 foot high. You couldn't get into the room. The room had 2 brown, large leather chairs, which were the chairs I used to sit in when I came to talk to him. You could just see them, but the whole of the floor was covered in these stalagmites. So I can't remember how long I spent there, but I sat in a brown chair and went through each of these stalagmites, turning them into 11 packing cases of files. I kept the folders as original. I didn't take anything out or into any folders, but I put them together in themes and put them in boxes of themes, and threw a lot of stuff away because at that point I was trying to get Durham or Oxford to take this archive, and neither were interested. So the boxes have had to migrate with me. I was then at Sussex, then to Birmingham, and then to Copenhagen. And eventually Bob and I were at a conference together, and I asked him for help because I desperately wanted to find a home for this archive. And on the 3rd try, Durham agreed, and suddenly saw the links between this archive, my archive, and Lambton's archive, which they just received. And Bob set up a website through the department, using the help of students on summer projects. So that's the background of how does this archive come about. And we've built the website around the papers that David either published or were obviously publishable, or the talks that he's given. And there are 4 main themes in his work. One is tribe and state and the politics of leadership. The next is migration and movement and dance. A third is gender, and then religion and symbolism. And we've set up these 4 themes with the papers in them so that you can read the connections in either direction. You can start with politics, or you can start with religion, or you can start with dance. Why? Well, I think it was very important because in the archive, and maybe the centerpiece of the archive, is 2 brown manila folders which are full of typed texts. And he's got 2 sets of notes in those folders. One which sets out those texts as if they were going to be a book called Kalantar. Kalantar is the leader that he was interested in. And the other is as if those texts were going to be organized as a book called Dancing the World. And they're both covering the same material, but one starts with the politics of the tribe, its histories, its big leaders, the smaller leaders, the migration, the way you have to deport yourself to be a successful leader, and the way that then carries into movement and dance. And that he turned into the script of the Oscar-nominated documentary. The other one starts the other way around, starts looking at dance, gender, learning to have a controlled and assertive movement, and that mirrors the migration and successful leadership. So he's moving either one way or the other through this material, and he kind of gets stuck in between. So what I've tried to do then, moving on to the next slide, there's a picture of Dalia Barhoda and Victoria Hofbauer, who have helped me in writing, in doing all this work, and they're actually in the room with me. I'll just turn my computer around so that you can wave at them. And we 3 have worked on this at our end. What we've done, we've read the 2 folders of typed texts, and we scanned them all and kept them as originally filed, exactly the same. But then we've retyped those that really cluster around those 4 themes so that they're easier to read. And we've chosen the most coherent ones, cut out duplication, and checked that they're not already, the points aren't already published somewhere else. And we've got that ready to go, especially around the issue of dance. Quite a lot of material to add to the website. There's 16 reel-to-reel tapes. Is it 16, Victoria? Did I get it right? Something like that. We've just, last Friday, had them finally digitized. And we've also found David's index of his music. So our next job is to try and link his descriptions of the dance to the music that he'd recorded. Then he has fieldwork diaries, and we've scanned all those so that we can read them without damaging the originals, and so that other people can read them without damaging, because they're a little bit fragile. And we've retyped his account of his first migration, which is absolutely fantastic. It's the most beautiful piece of writing. And there's a copy of 1 page on this slide. I know that you won't be able to read it very well, but you will get the idea that this writing is very legible at this stage. Later on, David's writing becomes deplorable, but at this stage, it's fantastic. Then he had a number of photographs which he scanned, and then we've been doing detective work to try and connect the photos to the named places on the migrations. And Dalia has plotted all this on a Google Earth map, which we'll show you in a minute. The files on the people of the wind, and he spent a lot of time advising TV programs and on nomads and on the Bakhtiari. I gave a paper based on that part of the archive, which is on the website. There's a collection of 50 historical pictures of the tribal leaders, and these we've scanned, and we've transcribed the names into English and Persian. Dalia has done that, and that's the other thing that's featured on this slide. Then there's a box of documents from the Public Records Office, which I know from doing this work myself takes months of work to find. If anyone wants to write the history of the Bakhtiari, David's done all the background work in the Public Record Office. It's all in a box, and we've catalogued it and scanned it all, so you don't even have to go to Durham to see it. You could ask the library for the scanned version. And then there's a mass of teaching and lecture notes, all in handwriting, and I have not even touched those. So that gives you an idea of what's there. Let's now go on the next slide to follow David through his field notebooks and see what he was doing in his research on the Bakhtiari. So what were the conditions when he arrived? Well, first of all the tribal leaders were protesting land reform. The army and the secret police, the Savok, were showing very strong control. David couldn't go to the tribes at all without a government sponsor. And he finds somebody called Mary Karagozlu, who offers to sponsor him. And I'll talk about her in a minute. And through her, he gets an introduction to the Plan Organization. What they're interested in is improving the health conditions of the Bakhtiari during their migration. David's wife, Marianne, is a nurse. It turns out they end up giving Marianne a commission to run a mobile clinic alongside the migration, and you can see her there on the picture dressed in a Bakhtiari coat with the Bakhtiari black pantaloons, looking after a Bakhtiari woman whilst her husband looks on nervously. But then they said today, all right, you can write a research report as well on the migration. So the two of them had jobs from the Plan Organization. From the field notes, I'm not sure they actually ever got paid for it, but at the beginning of the migration, they thought they were going to get paid for this. The next slide is to introduce Mary Karagozlu, and I've used mainly an obituary from the Independent to find this. She was the daughter of an American librarian and Nagi Khan, who was very senior in ruling circles in Tehran and owned a lot of villages around Hamadan, but died when Mary was very young. Mary went to the US and did a degree in agriculture, and then she married Majid Khan, who was the son of the last of the big Bakhtiari leaders. And they start turning some of his estate into mechanized dry wheat farming, which was excluded from the provisions of the land reform, so they could keep it if it was mechanized. And they put a lot of energy into building roads and bridges in the southwest of Iran, around the Bakhtiari area. Now, the Independent then says that it was the head of SAVOK that made Mary director of the Ministry of Tribal Affairs. I'm not sure about that, but I'm just quoting from the Independent here. The government was worried that through land reform and the tribal resistance, it was clear that the tribes were still too independent and destabilizing, and they wanted to settle the tribes. It looks like Mary maybe wasn't opposed to settling the tribes, but she also had the aim to improve their lives and also to improve meat production, where the nation was getting more and more dependent on meat from the tribes. In 1963 or 1964, I haven't been able to pin this down exactly, there was a terrific famine in the Bakhtiari. There was worry that they were literally going to be dying because they'd had no wheat harvest at all. And Mary bought up a mass of wheat and flour and started distributing it in time to save them. But then the ministry refused to pay her for it, so she sold her house in Tehran to pay off those bills. This becomes important later. A little bit later, she then gets accused of inciting tribal revolt against the settlement policy, and she's banned from ever going near the Bakhtiari again. She retreats to her husband's house in the Gulf and breeds Arab horses. And afterward, internationally, she's known for the work she did in getting recognition for Iranian Arab stud book. But in 1979, she was arrested by the Islamic Revolution forces to be executed. But protests by the Bakhtiari that she had saved them from the famine were successful in stopping her from being executed. So this is another indomitable woman creating quite a new role for herself within 1960s Iran. Moving on to the next slide. I've just spent a wonderful week reading David's notebooks, his field notebooks. And from the first days, you can see what was going on around him. A colonel arrived to collect arms from the Bakhtiari. Mary was still distributing wheat, but this time it was USAID wheat. She'd organised some tribesmen to build a road, and then the governor of the province came to open it, and a great fuss and bother about that. Everyone was very pleased with themselves. And then the head of the agricultural bank comes and goes with David and Mary on a tour around, making plans for irrigation to improve the farming. And meanwhile, she's also making plans for roads and bridges. And then the leaders of 42 of the sub-tribes of the Bakhtiari arrive and sign a protest about the government stealing their land through the land reform. And there's a quote from David's book, Chief of Barbadi. This is Jafar Quli, whose picture was on the slide about People of the Wind. Almost as tall as I am. Very charming man. And he really takes a shine to this guy. Meanwhile, David is learning to ride, which Anne Lambton knew how to ride and get around in Iran. David knew how to dance, but he didn't know how to ride, and he found it absolutely frightening. Then he started wearing Bakhtiari dress, and he says, I look daft and I feel it, and he draws a little picture of himself in his notebook. But he persistently wore Bakhtiari dress. Even when Savok called him in and starts chasing him around, he has to go to the office in Tehran and Ahvaz and goodness knows where. He's wearing Bakhtiari dress all the time, trying to persuade them that no, he's not trying to foment a revolution. But within a few days of him being in the area of Bakhtiari, he starts dancing. He did the stick dance for the first time. And he becomes part of Mary's team. And she seems to be regarded as the chief of one of the tribal sections, which is the one that he travels with. So I've just thrown a whole set of points there to give you a flavour of the torment and the number of things that are going on around him all at once. He begins on the next slide to try and work out who's who and what's what in the Bakhtiari. He reads all of the previous British Army officers' forays into Bakhtiari land to try and work out what the tribal structure is, and he starts building up his own. If you look at the top, you've got Bakhtiari, and then you've got Haftlang on the left. And the next line down, you've got Bakhtiar Wand, and the second one is Duraki. And then under Duraki, you've got Jeraswand, and then Osiwand. It's that lot that he ends up migrating with. And if you jump 2 spaces over to the right, you get Barbadi, which is where Jafar Quli, this admired leader, is the leader. So he's trying, and his notebooks are absolutely chock-a-block full of lists of, well, there's this family, and there's that group, and there's this group, and he's trying to plot them. Now note that this is set out like a family tree, and it's very classic for anthropology at this time to set out tribal structures as if they're some kind of reflection of a family growth, the growth of a family. Okay, let's move to the next slide, to the migration itself. This is the work that Dahlia's been doing. This is Google Earth, and we'll send you the address so that in the break, if anyone wants to play, you can get onto this and start zooming in on different valleys and get an idea of what's going on. But the pink bit at the bottom of this slide shows you they start off on the left-hand side in a town called Lali, and that's at about 277 meters above sea level. That gets very, very hot in the summer. So sheep and goats don't stand a chance in that kind of weather. They need to move to higher pastures. If you look at the far right, they end up at about 2,000 meters above sea level, which is nice and cool in the summer and fine for the sheep and goats, but very snowy and cold in the winter and no good at all for them. So they need to go back to the left-hand end to survive through the winter. So this is the logic of what the nomads are doing. They're using altitude to get the right temperature to and access to grass for their sheep and goats. But look in the middle. They have to go over one ridge of these Zagros mountains after another, after another, after another, after another, till the very big one is called Sardeku, and then it's further over a small one again, and then down into a valley. So let's just go through some steps in this migration. The first big stopping point prior to a major climb was what's called Munar, and that gives the name to the whole crossing. And you can, in the next slide, you can see this ridge of mountains with a kind of basin which is good for camping in, and then a zigzaggy line which is our best guess of the kind of route that they would have gone on. If you go then to the next picture, you begin to get some of David's photographs of Munar, and I think that, Bob, we can zip through these quite quickly, of going up the mountain, the very, very narrow paths that these people are having to go on. There are 8,000 to 10,000 people in the Osiwan group as a whole, and there are lots and lots of groups, all of that size, going through these mountain passes all at the same time. And one of the things that fascinated David, as you keep flicking through these, Bob, please, is how did these people manage to organize themselves so that they can get people and animals over these terrifically dangerous, slippery, narrow paths without bumping into each other, pushing each other off the edge, fighting, or whatever. And we end up in what's called Shimbar Valley, which should be another map, Bob. You've just come over the Munar Ridge and drop immediately into the Shimbar Valley, which is a very lush valley. The next slide is going down into Shimbar, and then the campsite that they took in Shimbar. Note on the right hand side the tripod for making butter. The woman puts the yogurt in a goat skin and hangs it from that tripod, and then shakes it backwards and forwards for ages to make butter and buttermilk. As if that isn't enough, the next slide shows that she's also making bread and cooking, and the women are just working non-stop. As soon as they arrive, they can't sit and have a cup of tea like the men. There's more to be done. But the point is, I think, from these slides, that they didn't put up their tents unless it was going to rain, because it took about an hour to put a tent up and an hour to put it down. As soon as they've kind of got their breath from that, then on to the next crossing in the next slide, called Hezar Chameh, which is 1,000 hazards. And the following slides show you what those hazards are. There's a slide of the donkeys wending their way round a big U-bend in the mountain. Another one, a similar one. You can see the number of donkeys of different groups that are trying to get up this place all at once. And it's not easy. Look at this guy pulling the donkey up over a rock by its ears. That's why donkeys have big ears, of course. And I've just put in the bottom of that one in red, a quote from David. The 20 mules carrying all our stuff made a noisy group of thoroughly fed up looking animals as they collapsed in floods of donkey tears and hysterics at all too frequent intervals. And that was before he really saw what they knew, which was what was coming for them, with this terrific job of getting over these passes. Here's a mule trying to get up over a rock, with the people lifting, pushing, shoving, and then the people themselves with children, the women with children on their backs, having to climb over these rocks too. Next we get into the Barzuf River, and then on the right hand side of that map you see the Zardeku, the big mountain. So the next slide is a close-up of today's Google map of the Barzuf River, and what Dalia pointed out here was it's just really a stream now, but you can see the width of the shingle, the width of the river as it used to be when David and the nomads were trying to cross it. So next we get pictures of them coming across the Barzuf River, swimming, wading. The mountains are snow-covered, you can see in the background, and they're melting. And he points out in the diary that it's best to cross early in the morning, because then the flow has slowed down. If you wait too long and the day's melt is coming shooting down the river, then the torrents are even worse. So you can see with this one with the sheep going over, the torrents that they're trying to cover, and then the next one with a man and donkeys and pulling a mule with a boy on the mule, the next one with a woman and a mule, and then relief as these very, very wet Bakhtiari are looking back over the river and seeing the sheep clambering up on the other side. This was the frightening, really frightening moment of the crossing. We don't have any pictures of going over the Zardeku, which the passes are quite wide, but it's always covered in snow. So having got themselves thoroughly soaked going through the snow melt on the Barzuf River, they then walk up over snow-covered mountains. But the other side takes you to the next slide, the summer quarters, which is a recent photograph. We don't have any of David's photographs for this period, but you can see what they're aiming for. There's Zardiku in the background. And okay, now this is today. It wouldn't have been so many plantations or villages then, but still green, lush grazing land. So I want to finish just with 3 slides to on David's work to try and pull together some of the themes that come over so strongly in his writing and in his field notebooks. And the next slide takes us to his admiration for these Kalantars and their leadership. What had happened was that at one point the Bakhtiari had had very big tribal leaders kind of appointed by the government and controlling the whole tribe. These had then, the government had dismissed them, and then these this new position of Kalantar, which is a word that comes from the Turkish tribes, not from the Bakhtiari, they get appointed by the government for the smaller level groups within the Bakhtiari. So there's a head of each of those smaller groups that were in that kind of kinshipy type diagram that I showed you. And he says, as he's in the plain where the whole migration starts at the beginning, his notebooks say that the Kalantars are meeting to decide the probable dates for starting the migration. And then the leaders underneath them decide the departure dates for their smaller groups within those larger groups. And then the camp groups, which are called Mal, they're also working out when to leave. And he has some lovely descriptions of the arguments at the early stages in the first couple of days as the people in the Mal are working out which route to go on and how fast to go. But one of the points that needs to be made is that each household, especially the man in the household, makes his own decisions and is responsible for his own household. So although these are leadership positions, they work through some kind of influence and admiration rather than through any authority. And this is what he finds very interesting. So then I've put in coloured different quotes from David's diary. There are groups of several hundred people, and they all have different starting dates. And each tribal section, Taife, must be sufficiently spread over the ground to graze all the sheep. Our Mal, our camp group, stayed for 3 days in Shimbar, and the day we left, some people from another group arrived on our spot. How did they know when we were going to move? Since weather conditions vary from one part of the mountains to another, how does news get round that a particular group is stuck for 2 days, as we were, for dust? Then in the red on the right, he says, the pressures for pushing on for grass and utilising the intervening lush valleys to the utmost, and the pressures of following tribesmen wanting their own share of the grass, calls for efficient and powerful leadership. And fights and disagreements have to be kept to a minimum, otherwise at the various mountain passes, which cause bottlenecks, chaos would ensue in the attempt to obtain pasture for the sheep. And then he says, eventually we came to the approaches of Munar. The path narrowed until we were going single file only. There are all sorts of tribes here, mostly Barbadi subsections and Duraki Toifes. Hundreds of the tribesmen, nose to tail, lined the route all along the side of the mountain. So here's some examples of how he's got quite fascinated by how these tribal leaders managed to hold things together. Let's go to the next slide. Because what he looks at is the process of learning to move in the world. And he sees migration as being a process of being preoccupied with control and the ordering of movement. He points out that movement is instilled from birth. Many children are born on the migration, or they're tied to a donkey as soon as they can sit up, or they're clambering over these rocks, and as soon as they can, they're carrying a kid on their back. But to move people and animals over the mountains demands an ability to read the environment, the changing weather, decisions about when or how fast to move or where to stop. And it demands ability to read a social environment, both to keep together your close group, because even your brothers or your very close group, they're all independent, going off potentially in their own directions. And how to hold those together whilst you've also got rival groups, you've got government, how to hold all that together through a kind of what he calls a vigilant self-assertiveness. There's a style and quality of movement that permeates how Black Tiari interact with the social and physical world. And then I've put together from reading his diary that the guy who led the camp group that David was part of, whose name was Jangi, was himself learning to move. He was the son of a previous Kalantar who's been killed, and he's not mature enough yet to take on that position. And it's great. David has recorded all the things that were happening to this guy, and it's clear this is a fantastic example of a Kalantar, or a hope to be Kalantar, learning to move in the world. He went too far on the first day, and then he had to wait a day for his sheep to recover because he'd worn them out. Then he had a member of another group in his camp group, and he followed that group's route because he didn't know his own way, so he had to come back. His mother berated him on one day because he'd been foolhardy. He went back over a pass at night, supposedly looking for a dog. The mother says, "You're in danger of being killed by thieves or bears," but he wanted to see the town lights. Couldn't stand being in the mountains without a bit of excitement. And he also, in his camp group, he had an experienced migrator who was there specifically to show him how to do the migration. And there's one very lovely example where David records a conversation where the experienced migrator is showing Janki how to choose a campsite in a defile, so that on three sides any attackers have to expose themselves against the skyline if they're going to come over. And all the way through then, Janki is having difficulty managing the contrary demands of his own tribal group and Mary as a member of his team. The next slide takes us then to David's idea about learning to dance. And this is only possible from someone who has learnt to dance in Bakhtiari. I never learnt to dance. Where I was quite good at riding, but hopeless at dancing. And it's a stick dance. You can see the two guys at the top. One's got a bigger pole and one's got a short, pliable pole. They circle round each other in tune to the music with a kind of hopping, what he calls a hop. And after they've circled round each other a while, the one with the short stick turns on the other guy and attacks him. And the aim is to try and hit the guy with the big stick on his ankles. And the guy with the big stick uses it for defense, sticks it in the ground, and then flings his feet out of the way, whichever way he thinks the attacker is going to hit him. So it's a very dramatic, very forceful dance. But there's some lovely stuff in David's books from actually learning to dance. He says the musicians point instruments at learners, buffeting them with rhythmic sound waves. The body feels and is moved by music. Before mastering the rhythm, one must first be mastered by it. And then he says, the style belongs to those who find the freest, most fluid expression within the defined limits of the rhythm. This is instantly recognized and much admired, and generates yells and ululations. And that is, I think, the clue to his link between learning to dance and learning to move in the mountains. So if we go to the next slide, one of the papers that David has written and that's on the website, I think really pulls together the linkage between the two sides of his work. Because he says that the migration and dance image each other. Dance embodies the same principles for ordering motion as the migration. Both there's a rhythm and a physical environment, and I would add also a political environment that constrains, and it must be known before somebody can gain the freedom to move within it. The physical and the social world and dance can only be known through participation. He has a number of wry comments in his diary where he says he was laughed at by the other tribes people for trying to look at the dance, and they said, no, get on and do it. And there's a constantly changing rhythm, and the movement of the dance is moving in opposite directions, as is the pressure from close kin and outsiders that's constantly moving you around. And it requires balance and action to achieve stability or to achieve some kind of control over that very complex situation. But he points out, and I'm sorry I missed this point, once the attacker has attacked the defender, they then swap positions. So then they circle around each other with the opposite poles and in the opposite positions. And he says, through that, you learn a double perspective, both attack and defense, the self and the other. You learn to position yourself in the world. And then hitting the ankle, the capacity to move. And he points out that in the dance, there's a flex in the ankle, which is the scarcely perceptible source of style. And overall, the aim is to be deceptive, to not let anyone else know what you're going to do, but to be alert, be self-assertive, so as to manage, bring all these contrary and complicated relationships in together and work out how to move through the dance and through the mountains. And this he calls the principles of how to operate in the world, how to know the world, how to be Bakhtiyari. So that is my attempt to summarize David's work. I don't know what time I started, Bob, and whether I should stop now or whether I should just run through and give you a taster of what I was doing, but you haven't rung me, so I shall keep going. So the next slide is about me. I came from a small farm in Essex, which meant that I was pretty good at quite a lot of the farming kind of things, pretty bad at all the work the women had to do. And I was interested in people's participation in large-scale processes of political transformation. And I've kept that interest through a number of different sites, starting with my work in Iran, Northeast English villages, and more recently, universities in the global knowledge economy. But my archive consists of the research I did on one section of a group of people called Doshman Siari Mamasani. And there I've listed the various things I've got in the archive. Next slide, the conditions of fieldwork. I had to spend 5 months in Tehran trying to get permission, which completely ruined my economy and also my timescale. When I got down to Shiraz University, David Marsden, who was David's former student, was away, and there was nobody in the university venturing out of the town. They all said, oh no, there's fleas and dirt in the tribes. So eventually I found a group of students who were studying birth control methods in the villages and doing development projects with villages, and I went with them. And they introduced me to people in a village in Doshman Siari, and then those people decided that I could stay because they were having big conflicts arising whenever they were trying to set up development projects. The context, by now in the 70s, the oil income is being used to boost a middle class, and the rural world is seeing none of it. The wheat is being subsidized and rice is being subsidized in the urban areas so that people can no longer grow wheat for even to cover their expenses. So there's very bad impoverishment in the rural areas. The ministries are well established, but the rural areas are seeing no roads, no water, no electricity, no access to oil, no health services. And SAVAK, the secret police, is up and running. The next slide shows you the main village of the tribal section where I was located. And one of the interesting things was that when I started, the person who hosted me said, don't go to bad houses. But when you look at that, with all those houses joined up to every other house, how do you know what's a bad house and what's a good house. But do note there's a ravine running right the way through the village, which separates what's called Upper Village and Lower Village. And on the left-hand side, there's a little white building of the gendarmes, keeping a beady eye on everything that's going on. The next slide just shows you these people have been forcibly settled by Reza Shah in their summer quarters, which means that it's incredibly cold in the winter with snow. So there's a couple of pictures there to show you the snow. But in the summer, it's delightful. But again, I've given you some pictures of the ways in which the houses are all joined up together. And then on the right-hand side, each house, maybe there would be two brothers have their houses around one yard. They're built defensively for the animals to be in the central courtyard. The next slide. There was no way I could map the political structure or organisation in the kind of kinship diagram that David had. Each tribal section was founded by 7 to 8 refugees. They all had an apocryphal story. Of course, they didn't mention their wives until you asked them about them. But they came from 2 different family groups, and those 7 to 8 refugees had actually been the source of 2 lineages, which gave their names to the 2 main divisions in the village. And then there had been successive waves of refugees from all over tribal Iran who'd married into, worked for the more established refugees. So you had layers and layers of people working for each other, marrying into each other, lots and lots of small patrilineages. And the layout of the village was small little clusters of houses, as if they were patrilineages. But they were all married, their sisters were married to each other and wives. So it was a whole network held together by women. And at New Year, the men, in the top diagram, the patrilineage came to the house of the oldest and most respected member of their patrilineage to pay their respects, as if the society was organised by patronage. And the year the snow was still on the paths, so by early morning, the paths were all footmarks gathering up, leading to the house of this big man of this group and leading to another one, as if it was all formed of patrilineages. But then after lunch, the women then went and visited all of their relatives, and a group of sisters would come together, and they came from different places, had relatives all over the place. So they walked all over the neat paths and patterns that the men had set up. And it really demonstrated in just one morning the different way of looking at the village from a male patrilineage point of view, or the women and where they were married. And the tension was that the men tried to hold their groups together, but of course every brother was married to or connected to another group. So, and it was the women that all the tension imploded on. So it was next slide, a very, very tense time. Historically in this tribe, whenever there had been factional politics in Tehran or Shiraz, Doshman-Ziyar is split between rival khans, rival tribal leaders who have now got rid of, and every tribal section, every village, even every family split. And there was tension, it's a history of battles. Now there are no official leaders at all. But the village had again split between upper and lower. And the daily life was spent in the men meeting or the women meeting in the afternoon around whatever work they were doing, analysing each other's actions and what somebody had said to somebody else for clues about who was going to move into which group and support which group. So the next slide, I've just put here some pretty pictures basically to make the point that the wheat and the rice cultivation was terribly low income. And the next slide, even grapes, they had vineyards, but the roads were too rough to be able to get the grapes to town to sell. There were still some nomads, and they were doing quite well, but very few of them. But the next slide takes you to the tribal education program. And this is part of the Modernising State from 1949. America had included Iran in its Point 4 Technical Assistance Program, and in 1954 they set up a program of tribal literacy. And Bahman Begi was appointed the director. He was from a minor Qashqai tribal leader group, but he fell out with the big tribal leaders. And what happened then was the big tribe said, no, don't you go and have anything to do with Bahman Begi. And this little tribe where I worked said, ho, ho, ho. And they absolutely flooded the tribal education program. So in the main village in 1975, the one that I showed you the picture of, there were 260 households, in which there were 200 teachers, and half of them were women. So the story I'm telling here is that a girl's salary as a teacher was better than the best income that her father could get from doing wheat and rice and animals and grapes and a bit of smuggling. So they begin, and here's a picture of one of the village teachers, to begin to wear much finer clothes and to deport themselves in a way that begins to command attention. They also are posted, 200 of them, maybe 4 of them are working in the village. The rest are posted all over Iran. At New Year, they come back with knowledge about what's going on throughout Iran. The next slide is just pictures of the terrific enthusiasm for education that was in the village. And the next then, the main argument that comes out of my research was that actually, whereas I think the Shah may be expected that his modernization of the state would create some kind of rational government, which would be the normal theoretical approach of the time, what was happening here was that the two sides were actually using the modern state to continue their fight in the bureaucracies. So the tribal leaders who'd lost their positions over the tribe had sent their sons to the USA for education, and one came back and was in charge of court cases from Doshmansiari, and another one was in the ministry that controlled the nationalized pastures and forests. So anyone who went out to get firewood, the forest guards would arrest you and accuse you of having cut green wood, which of course is no good for firewood, so why would you? And then you were sent to Shiraz and then had to pay a fine, so-called, to get out. So they were trying to reassert their kind of arbitrary kind of power over the tribe through their positions within the bureaucracy. On the other side, the teachers were by now becoming quite important as administrators in the Ministry of Tribal Education, in charge of allocating which teachers went to which village. And their overall aim was very much to create a literate population who could manage their own affairs with the state and wouldn't need the intercession of the tribal leaders, would be self-assertive. Here's this same theme from Lampton, from David. Here I find it again. And also to learn to cooperate. And the teachers set up a lot of projects using co-funding from the provincial governor. So again, they brought in another bit of the state to build a water supply in the village and a bathhouse. And they organized it in such a way as to try and show people how they could achieve things by equal participation of all, instead of terribly hierarchized and tense relationship. But it ends up in battles in most of the tribal sections in the area. My last slide. So some of the people who've been defeated in the battles, and these really were battles, and had fled to the shanty town in Shiraz, regrouped and managed to buy, and land it wasn't usually for sale, a very small piece of land under the nose of the tribal leader himself. And they built a model village that was going to be based on equal participation. And I went and joined them and was working with them and learned to be a reflexive anthropologist, I think, through them, by their discussing with each other, if we're going to be equal, how should we say hello to each other? Should we do all the usual kind of bowing and scraping, or should we just say hello to each other? How should we take a cup of tea from each other? How do we actually create a society that's based on equal relationships? How do we create the polity that we want to live in? And this, I think, was an example. In 1976, everyone knew there was going to be a revolution. We didn't know when or how, but everybody was thinking, what kind of polity do we want to create? So I can stop there. There's a final slide, which is a bit of a conclusion, but you can just leave that on the board, Bob. Thanks.